Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to our amazing audience from wherever you are joining from. Welcome to another episode of SecPod webcast. I'm Jagsir, your host. Like always, I have today's session is a special session, right? And today's session we're doing with one of our esteemed partners, Auxiom, and we have uh, an amazing speaker with us who's going to talk about the critical need for advanced vulnerability management processes, right? And the reason I say today's session is amazing because the speakers that we have today, they carry a varied experience, right, from multiple perspectives. And of course, they're going to talk about this as well as all the other important topics for the CISO community, for the security teams, and organizations in such. So I have with me Earl and Rob. Earl Duby, who is the Chief Info Security Officer at Auxiom, and Rob Kelsall, Global VP of Enterprise Sales at SecPod. Earl and Rob, why don't you tell a little bit about yourselves to our audience? And in fact, if you can tell one thing funny that you find or that you can recall from your experiences that you would want to share with our audience, that would be amazing.
So, welcome everyone. Glad you guys could join us today. I'm Earl Duby. I'm the CISO at Auxiom, as Jagsir had pointed out. And, just to kind of give a little background of why I'm here and, a little bit of where all this experience that Jagsir was talking about. I mean, it's amazing to me sometimes to think that I've been in this industry for, 25 plus years. It's just crazy. But for many years, I was the CISO at a company called Lear Corporation, which is a large automotive supply company here in Detroit. I've also been CISO at a startup. I've been CISO at another automotive supply company. So, I've been doing this for a while. I understand the concept of vulnerability management from the practitioner side for many years. And that's why I'm really looking forward to this conversation because Rob and I have known each other for many years, and I've worked with him through a couple different iterations of his employers, but we always have good conversations. And we were just talking last week, and we talked for a good hour and didn't even know that the time had slipped by. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. In terms of funny things, yeah, I'm a CISO. There's really not a whole lot funny going on. It's I wouldn't say that I'm overly serious, but yeah, it's maybe I'll get back to you later on that one.
Yeah, we're going to remember that, Earl. Rob, over to you.
Yeah, welcome everybody wherever you're calling from. My name is Rob Kelsall, as Jagsir said. I've been working in the vulnerability management space now for 20 plus years as well. So that kind of ages myself and Earl, I think. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, maybe our customers will tell us if that experience pays off. But I've been working in this space for a long time, seen many things from the perspective of when I started my career as a developer, through to a consultant, through to pre-sales, and now in more of a sales role. But I've always kept that kind of good understanding of the problems that we're trying to solve, and I always have fun talking to customers and partners. In fact, Earl, I can't even remember when we first met, but it would have been in Detroit. And I was just thinking the funniest thing I could think of that meeting was it was the first time I'd ever been to Detroit, and I was hoping to see RoboCop, and I didn't. So that was a disappointment. But I think you said they're going to put a statue up of RoboCop in Detroit soon, right, Earl?
Yeah, they're planning on putting a statue of RoboCop somewhere up in Detroit somewhere. So I have my fingers crossed because I would love to see it.
Well, that will definitely be a reason to come back, but hopefully I'll get back before that. see you in person. It's been a while, and I think this suit jacket actually did up last time I saw you in person. So we'll try and get something on the calendar very soon. But yeah, always have fantastic conversations with Earl. As a vendor, I always try and learn something from customers, as well as obviously help and advise. And I think when you were at Lear, Earl, you definitely taught me a thing or two, which I took on into other accounts as well. So always appreciate that.
All right. Hey, one of the things I like about what we're doing here today is, Rob, where are you at? You're in the UK right now.
Yeah.
and Jagsir, you're in India, and then
I'm in India.
And I'm sitting just outside of Detroit. So, this just goes to show you the global, impact of vulnerability management, and the fact that we have 3 different people from 3 different continents basically talking about this topic today.
Well, the other funny thing is I should have been there, right? We were going to have a dinner this evening, but we're going to reschedule that. So if anyone in the Detroit area wants Earl to buy them dinner, you should reach out, and we'll get you onto our next dinner opportunity.
Yeah,
that's a nice offer. But by the way, Earl, since you bring it up, what's more lovely is our audience also is part of our audience is from the United States, part of it is from India, and then there are folks running in from Europe. So we represent the audience as well. It's good to see that. Yeah. So coming back, before we jump into the discussion, I would like to remind everybody that we will have this recording of this session shared on your email, sent to your email, so you can share with your colleagues. We are also going to have it on our YouTube channel, as well as on our Bright Talk channel there. So if you would like to view this later, you can. Right. And what's more amazing is Rob here is offering anybody who is going to ask interesting question or jump into the conversation, make it more interesting, a copy of Effective Vulnerability Management by Chris Hughes. Right. And what that means is you can put your questions in the chat window below your Bright Talk player at any point of this session, and we're going to take those questions and answer them as we talk through this webinar. And there's the last slide that I'm going to have before we jump in. So there are no slides on this session. It's going to be more of a free conversation between Rob, Earl, and I. So feel free to ask your questions as you get them. With that, Rob, over to you. And as we were talking, right, you bring mountainous experience from the vendor side, right? And then Earl represents the other side. You can call it the customer side of the CISO community. So I think that's an amazing balance. But you have talked about a couple of experiences, right, where the need for advanced vulnerability management usually comes up. Would you like to share that with our audience? Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jagsir. And just to repeat there, the offer for anybody who asks a question that helps Earl and I continue this fun conversation today, we will be sending out a free copy of Chris Hughes' latest book, which is excellent. But I would say I haven't finished it yet because I left it on the last plane ride I was on. So somebody will be enjoying a free copy already. But absolutely, Jagsir, there is a need for advanced vulnerability management processes across many different types of organizations, and many new types of organizations, I think, that perhaps didn't have a security focus before. They sure do now. When I think about when I started my career in the vulnerability management space, we always talked about silos. The silo between the security team and the IT operations team. And back 20 years ago, we were trying to drive a kind of integrated solution to help those teams break down the wall and work together. I stepped out of IT security for a little bit more recently. And as I got back in and joined SecPod, I was like, surely this problem would have been solved. And the fact is, it hasn't. Whether it be a small organization or a large organization, I'm still seeing the separate security team using a scanner, the separate IT ops team using a patch management tool. So while it's disappointing that this problem hasn't been fully addressed, it is encouraging to see now that organizations are realizing that this needs to change. And I think, one of the things that's driving that is just how many different types of vulnerabilities or weaknesses there are in systems right now. So it could be, an IoT device has got some technology. I mean, even your fridge can have a screen and can help you restock it now. Technology can be in everything. And with technology comes weakness. And attackers are always going to try to exploit those weaknesses. To give you an example, I recently, if you follow me on LinkedIn, you may have seen this, but I recently had my car stolen in the UK. And I was talking to Earl a few weeks back about the amount of technology that's in a car now. You almost need to have a patch management solution for your vehicle, but unfortunately, you have to rely on the vendor to do that for you. But it was interesting that I saw as attackers or thieves tried to steal this vehicle, they were increasingly trying to exploit a weakness, whether that be a physical weakness or some kind of technological weakness.
Well, I think you have to explain that these guys were coming at your car multiple times. This wasn't just a one-time attempt, but tell everyone how many times they were actually trying to steal this car.
So this was seventh time lucky for the thief.
That's incredible.
Time. But the interesting thing, if you recall, when I was chatting about this, is they were trying to exploit different weaknesses each time, and then I would put a different control in place. Right. And I think that's very similar in the IT world, right? We can't always fix everything, but we can try and put controls in place to make it harder. I thought with that vehicle, I could make it hard enough so that I'd be able to keep it. But no, one of the first times they tried just a physical attack, let's see if we can get in, couldn't get into it. Second or third time, they were actually using a scanning device on my front door, trying to relay the signal from the key to the vehicle. That didn't work, but only because I have a compensating control of the key goes in a Faraday pouch, so it can't transmit the signal. So there's compensating control number one. They then come back with one of these new devices that actually continues to repeat the signal until it finds the right signal and unlocks the car. And this is actually a known vulnerability in a lot of German cars. I actually called Audi and asked what they would suggest as a compensating controller if there was an update to this. And they said they probably can't start the vehicle. They can just get it open, probably. But they suggested for this, there's an Audi RS4, so not cheap. They suggested for this rather expensive vehicle that I went and bought a steering wheel crook lock and put that on so they couldn't steal it. So again, the vendor is talking about a compensating control for a weakness in the vehicle. Finally, I did put the crook lock on. The thieves actually broke into the house. They stole the keys and they got the vehicle. Could there be a compensating control for that? My house in Arizona, it's called an AR-15. Doesn't work too well in England because it's not legal. But Earl, I don't know what examples or stories you have there as well.
But just to touch on what you were saying there, I find it interesting, and this again is very synonymous with just technology in an organization. So you have this cutting edge vehicle with all of this technology in it, and the control that they suggest you put into place is a steering wheel lock.
Yep.
So this is like 1980s technology that they're telling you to defend this, 2024, highly technical car with, and it's very similar to how you have to defend an organization. We still have firewalls that are the main control on perimeter defense. Firewall technology has been around since the 70s, and so, I always had this complaint when I was, building up security programs of, like, why is it always about buying more? Like every time I buy a new control, I don't get rid of anything. It's like, yeah, that's exactly right, because the old controls are preventing a certain type of attack. Meanwhile, you have to keep building in new controls to prevent new attacks. And this is why our environments get so complicated, is because we have to carry this whole technology stack to defend against all of these complexities that are being introduced into our corporate environments. And I think that's one of the big challenges with vulnerability management is we just keep adding complexity to our corporate environments, and we're outpacing our ability to actually add controls to these new complex systems. And the adversaries are definitely taking advantage of that complexity, and you see the economic incentives with exploiting those those complex environments. So it's like this confluence of two converging trends, which is highly complex networks and highly motivated and economically incented adversaries are creating this perfect storm of attacks that you were talking about earlier of like, why does it just feel like there's more attacks? Because there actually are. There literally are more attacks going on, and they're bigger and they're faster. And when artificial intelligence gets worked into there, you're going to see a velocity of attack that nobody is going to be prepared to handle.
Yeah, Earl, I think AI is definitely a good reason why the number of attacks have increased, right? I remember, again, back when I was a sales engineer, and we would try and educate people on how easy it is. We'd just take something like Metasploit, send a phishing link asking the group what they wanted for lunch. They click the link and they get a blank page, and then we tell them in the presentation, hey, you remember that blank page you clicked? Now here's your webcam. If you add AI onto that, I don't even need to know to go and get Metasploit anymore. I could just say, I could get ChatGPT, hey, create me a phishing link that does this and exploits this vulnerability in a browser, send it to the CISO of company XYZ. The technology's there to allow attackers to automate attacks. So if organizations are not automating their processes around managing the weaknesses, they're just fighting a losing battle.
But I think this might be a good opportunity to explain exactly what continuous monitoring or continuous vulnerability management means, to you, to SecPod, so that we can kind of differentiate old school vulnerability management from what we're actually, advocating for people to do.
Yeah, definitely. So, again, if I'm casting my mind back to when I got into this industry, it would be the security team running some kind of vulnerability scanner on their network. It would produce a PDF report. They would give that report to the operations team. The operations team would then, the clock is ticking. You've got 30 days to go and patch all these critical vulnerabilities. There's a few different problems with that. One was that it was a scanner and it only scanned what was switched on at the time of the scan. Even if they amalgamated multiple scans over time, that's just delaying the results getting to the operations team. But then, what if a laptop user had self-updated, but now the IT ops team is looking at deploying patches when actually those vulnerabilities don't exist anymore? So for me, the continuous means bridging that gap between the security team, the ops team, and providing information as real time as possible. So what we do here is combine the best of both: a network scanner with an agentless scanning capability, agentless and agent-based scanning capability, to provide real-time visibility of those agent-protected systems, as well as combined and integrated visibility of those network devices that don't necessarily have an agent on. And because the IT operations team is using the same tool to fix the problem, they can see in real time, this system has this vulnerability, here's the fix, and click to go push that fix to that system. It sounds super simple and it sounds obvious. And again, 20 years ago, I was talking about the need to do this, but people didn't do it. And a lot of organizations I speak to have still got that separate security team using a different tool to the solution that their IT ops team uses. And Earl, obviously, you've seen a lot of companies as well. I mean, what do you think? Why do you think people have still kept those silos in place? Can you think of a good reason, perhaps?
There isn't a good reason. I mean, the reason is, unfortunately, a lot of it is just politics. It's the way that internal teams are kind of structured. You have the security team who's kind of over here, and you have the infrastructure team who's kind of over here, and you have the application team who's over there. And you need all three of those teams to work together, because it's not just the infrastructure team. You also need the application team on board, because a lot of times you can't update the infrastructure until there is some update to the application that's sitting on that infrastructure. So you need all three of those parties to work together. And typically when you're talking about VPs or director level people, sometimes making that collaboration doesn't work that well. But I think this is also what's driving a trend. And if you look around, you'll see this starting to happen a little bit more frequently. Is typically the CIO of an organization, in the past, it used to almost be an automatic promotion for like an application director or VP of applications. They would move into a CIO position. But now, I see more and more the CISOs are moving into CIO positions. And I think this is people are starting to recognize that being the CIO of an organization is about more than just making sure applications run. There's a large risk management component that's involved with running IT and running technology for an organization. And so there's almost a better alignment between the risk management thought processes of a CISO and then migrating into a CIO position and then applying risk management across the entire stack that way. And I think it's partly to break down those silos of saying, hey, look, instead of having these three organizations working, really separately and then rolling up to the CIO, if you can have risk management taken more specifically by that CIO, I think maybe that causes some of those conversations to happen and some of that collaboration to happen. So it's definitely a trend that I'm welcoming. I definitely think that more risk management thought process needs to be integrated into technology teams. So some progress there, I think.
Absolutely. I think when we talk about the need for advanced processes and how organizations have realized that, it's because of maybe something that's happened where they've maybe seen that a silo has caused a delay in the remediation, or maybe the operations team has actually decided, I'm going to actually turn things around and I'm going to elevate strategic importance to improving cybersecurity, and they want to have different tools themselves, or vice versa. The security team wants to take control and start fixing things. So I think there are many reasons, but I think one of the changes that I've started to see organizations look for is in why do they patch, right? So if you ask an IT operations team, why do you patch? If they're not very security savvy, the answer is going to be because I have to patch within 30 days. I hear that a lot. Right?
Yeah.
Sometimes even the security team isn't that technically savvy. And if you ask them, they'll say because it's good best practice to patch within 30 days. But if we take a step back, we should be asking collectively as an organization, this comes to your point in terms of the team starting to integrate. The real reason is we're trying to prevent a cyber breach in our organization. As a team, we need to get together and make it difficult. Just like the car being stolen, what controls can I put in place to make it difficult for that vehicle to be stolen? People are still going to try and get in, and they'll find a whole magnitude of different weaknesses in the system to get in. But the harder you can make it for somebody, the less likely your organization is going to be the victim of a cyber breach, and you're going to end up in the headlines. And that's good for him.
It's interesting, that line of thought right there, because, I hear all the time, whether it's at, client sites that I go to, or whether it's conferences I go to or whatever, you see the recognition that there are a lot more attacks going on. So executives are much more in tuned with the fact that the landscape is getting more challenging out there. The thing that I find a little bit amazing, though, is that beyond just understanding that there's a lot more breaches, there aren't good recognitions of why that's happening. Like, people aren't making the connection between, hey, there is a breach to this network and the fact that there are vulnerabilities in that network that are being exploited. So instead of focusing on vulnerability management, I see a lot of companies focusing on detection and response. So they're saying, hey, you know, the world's getting more challenging out there. There's more attacks. We need to spend more money on detection and response capabilities. And I'm not saying you don't need to spend money on detection and response capabilities, but that's only half the problem. You know, they're still ignoring the cause of the problem. So, you know, they're going after, hey, I want to detect an attack, when I would say, why don't we start thinking about how we prevent the attack? And, you know, when you start looking at small and mid-sized companies, you know, almost all of them will have endpoint detection and response, whether it's, you know, some consumer grade product or whether they actually do invest in something that's a little bit more enterprise ready, but they'll still have that investment in endpoint detection. Almost none of them are doing vulnerability management. So, you know, I constantly am having this conversation with, you know, it's great that you're detecting things. You know, it's kind of like having security guards running around inside of a museum trying to protect, you know, priceless paintings that are on the wall, but yet not really going around and checking to see if the doors are locked or the windows are locked after hours. So, you know, you're putting all the pressure on your detection and response capabilities when you could be taking a big chunk of the load off of those tool sets by focusing more on the vulnerability side and just reducing your attack surface. So, you know, I think it's, you know, to the point you were trying to make is, you know, I think we still haven't gotten all the parties in the right mindset of, you know, looking at vulnerabilities as opposed to detecting things. You know, infrastructure teams invest lots of money into monitoring tools and, you know, management tools to detect when things are happening. Security teams are doing the same thing. They're investing lots of money into tools that will detect, you know, anomalies or detect unauthorized access or detect different things. But yet there's still this vast, you know, unaddressed space of vulnerability management and processes that make that work. And it goes beyond just patching your, you know, doing your Microsoft patches. You know, so like, you know, you have almost this hierarchy of vulnerability management where you go from basically having nothing, where you're not even aware of what's going on in your environment. Then you might have a layer above that, which is a little bit better, but, you know, using like WSUS or something to apply your Microsoft patches, you know, and that's, you know, that's average, you know, I think. And then what we're talking about today is this advanced continuous vulnerability management, which addresses another higher level, which is, it goes beyond Microsoft. It goes into Adobe. It goes into, you know, IIS things and Apache and all these other different things that are exploitable, and making sure that those environments are also clear. So, you know, there's a maturity model here that has to happen. And unfortunately, a lot of people are still on this bottom, like layer 0, where they're just not even thinking about how do we reduce our attack surface. And we're just going to rely on detection to tell us after the fact that we've been breached.
Oh,
Yeah, I definitely get that a lot. Sorry, Jagsir, did you want to jump in
yeah,
there?
yeah. So Earl, while you were speaking, right, we have a question from the audience. The question is, with you mentioning MDR is only half the battle, do you think the onus falls on MDR providers to help minimize the attack surface of their clients and provide that continuous vulnerability management?
Yeah, I think they're starting to do that. You know, if you look at some endpoint products, you know, and I don't want to, kind of cast my vote for any endpoint products. But, if you look at some of them, like let's say Sentinel-1, for example. So Sentinel-1 is an endpoint detection product. The agent is deployed on all your endpoints, and it's there doing detection and response capabilities. But there's actually some pieces of Sentinel-1 that will tell you when there's like an application defect. So it'll tell you like, hey, you have an Adobe version that isn't up to date. So there are some capabilities in these endpoint detection tools that will allow you to do that. But then that still comes back to process. Like, how are you processing that information? So like Sentinel-1 can tell you that there's a problem, and that's good. So it's definitely a step forward that the endpoint products are starting to step into that, because I think that's very useful. But then you still get back to the organization itself and how is its maturity model around vulnerability management. So if you get the information, what are you doing with it? And how are you communicating that to, if that's an application issue, you have to go talk to the application team and you have to talk to the infrastructure team generally. So if it's about updating an application, you have to make sure that the hardware that application is setting on can be, can support the upgraded model. Because I see a lot of situations where people are trying to do something that we used to call sweating the assets, which basically means you buy a server and then you try to run the thing for 15 years. Well, when you try to run a server for 15 years, chances are you're not going to be able to run the latest version of applications that you need to run. So you're now running in an old version of application that can exist on the old server that you don't want to invest in, which means you can't patch those applications. So Sentinel-1 can tell you all day long that you have, out of date applications, but unless you're committed to actually doing the vulnerability management, that information isn't going to be that useful to you. I mean, it'll tell you that you have, maybe a danger spot. You need to, kind of be maybe ultra aware, but the real thing that we're talking about here is identifying your vulnerabilities and then having the process maturity to actually go fix that stuff, which starts with having collaboration between these different teams instead of competition, based on, basically scarce resources. Because, part of the problem is the infrastructure teams, competing for a certain amount of that budget, and the application teams competing for a certain amount of that budget. And so you have these groups that aren't necessarily, in functional harmony because they're in daily competition for scarce resources, for budget, people, and things like that. All of that stuff is what feeds into a mature and continuous vulnerability management process.
Got it. Interesting. And since both of you have talked about how vendors and security teams work together, right, to build a good vulnerability management program, and Rob, you have talked about how vendors have been transforming all this while, and earlier talked about how the IT teams and security teams have been transforming. Right, there's also a third party on the side that's also writing the ground rules or setting the ground rules, right? The regulators and the institutions for defining frameworks and helping vendors and security teams to stay ahead in the game. How have you both seen the transformation from the regulation side, right? So basically, are is vulnerability management becoming better? How do you see the role of regulators in that?
Go ahead, Earl.
Well, I was just going to say, I think that's probably the biggest game changer that's going on, is the fact that, you now start to see the federal government stepping into this and saying, hey, look, even though we're kind of tasked with protecting federal agencies, we also feel this commitment to helping the private sector as well. And so you start to see things like like the CMMC coming out of the Department of Defense saying, hey, if you want to be a supplier to the Department of Defense, even though you're a public sector company, you still have to comply with these requirements. And one of those requirements is having a good vulnerability management program in place that is going to identify vulnerabilities and fix those vulnerabilities, and having policy and process around that. So I do think that, typically I'm not a big regulatory guy. I think, sometimes we should just let the free market work. But in other cases, the free market kind of hasn't taken a great grasp of these things. And so I think these regulations are actually helping out. And then we also see it not just in regulation, but in third-party risk management programs. So you look at some of the largest companies, in the country, like General Motors. General Motors is pushing requirements down to their supply base that are actually compelling them to do certain things, and vulnerability management is one of those things. And so it's not just a good to have anymore. It's an actual requirement if you want to be a supplier to General Motors. And I think these two things, so the regulatory push from the government, along with the third-party risk management programs coming out of these large suppliers, basically the top end of the supply chain, and pushing those down, is starting to force people to at least start asking the question about, like, hey, how do we do this? And that's where someone like me, and Rob too, we've been around long enough, we can actually help companies figure out how to implement a vulnerability management program that will actually work and help to reduce that attack surface so that they can comply with regulations, third-party risk management programs, and stave off some of those attacks that are happening.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. So it's not just about even buying a solution that's good from a vendor, right? It's about having the people and processes around that, which is definitely where I know Auxiom helps a lot of organizations. But just thinking about, what types of verticals are heavily regulated, and any security vendor that I've worked with has always sold to primarily banking and finance for that reason. They have to be compliant. They have to be patched up to date and not have vulnerabilities or lose customer information. Other organizations haven't been under the spotlight so much. So manufacturing, as an example, they have a lot of machinery that didn't used to have a lot of technology in it. Now it does, and of course can be very vulnerable as well. But I think more recently, those manufacturers, as you say, Earl, that are providing parts to other organizations that are regulated, and now getting those regulations pushed down. So you find organizations that didn't necessarily have a security team before, or even a focus on security, they didn't want to patch anything in case it breaks production of something. Right? They just leave it the same. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. Those organizations now suddenly find themselves faced with a pass down regulatory compliance, and they're like, where do we start? And we've seen an explosion in the manufacturing industry here at SecPod. We doubled our number of customers last year, and a big drive of that was in the manufacturing space. So that's good to see. Obviously, we can help. We have a fantastic product, but of course, with partners such as yourself, Earl, you can provide that expertise and manpower around the solution to ensure it's implemented correctly and the correct processes are put around that.
Yeah, it's really challenging. Like manufacturing, one of the issues with manufacturing is just a lot of them run on very thin margins. So when you look at financial services, they can basically print their own money, because whenever they need it, they just raise their fees, or there's plenty of ways for financial service companies to create the budget to invest in tools. Manufacturing companies run off of very thin margins. I've spent a large portion of my career in manufacturing, and I know what it's like to try to put a security budget together on the margins that manufacturing companies make. And so this kind of gets to another component of vulnerability management, in the sense that, typically what's happened is, you have a small budget and you swing all that budget over to things like detection and response and maybe security awareness training. And then vulnerability management is kind of left, on the side and not really addressed. And I think that's really the mindset that we're trying to change, is the fact that you can't be heavy on one side of the equation. You have to spread this budget across evenly. I would be happier if people invested in a cheap, crappy solution than to not invest in anything at all and be totally ignorant of what vulnerabilities are going on in their environment. Because you have to start addressing where you have these gaps in your environment. You think about vulnerabilities. Some of these companies are running servers. Now, I said this earlier. They're literally running servers that are 15 and 20 years old, which is absolutely insane. But I understand when you have not a lot of budget, that you're going to try to squeeze as much of that as you can out, and that may have worked 10 years ago. This is the part that another thing that people aren't realizing is that the environment of today is not the same as it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. Things that you could kind of hide on your network for a while in the past, you just can't hide those anymore, because typically everything now is speaking to the internet, or it's at least accessible by the internet. And most of the attacks now are automated attacks. It's not like this image that people have of, hey, there's this pimply kid sitting down in the basement that's just attacking people. No, that's not how this works, man. These are automated attacks where people are using tools and artificial intelligence to scan networks, and they find these devices that have on your network. They'll find them and they'll attack them. And so we have to start thinking about security budgets in a different way. You can't just throw all your budget over on one side. You have to spread this across there, and you have to start putting the processes in place to continuously be looking for these gaps, as opposed to, I still have people today saying, hey, can you do an annual vulnerability assessment for us? So basically they want us to come in and just run a scan once a year to look for their vulnerabilities. And it's like, no, that's almost pointless. You have to you find the gap, you try to fix the gap, because there's something new coming out, every day, every week. And so you have to constantly be on top of that.
Some people think that having an annual pen test negates the need for a vulnerability management solution that they would manage themselves. I find it crazy. I know you find that crazy, Earl, but I guarantee next week I'll hear it from somebody.
Well, the thing, the other thing I notice is definitions. Like, people just lump all this stuff together. So there are internal vulnerability scans. That's where you put an agent on all your devices and you scan them for missing patches or out of date software. So that's internal vulnerability scanning. Then you have external vulnerability scanning, which is usually a different tool set. That's where you scan your externally facing IP addresses with something like, say, a bit site or a security scorecard or a Blue Voyant or something, and it just looks at your internet facing posture and gives you a score. Usually they give you like an A, B, C, D type of a score, and they'll say, here's services that you have exposed. So that's external vulnerability scanning. And then the third piece is penetration tests, what I always call a red team exercise. So that is, actual trained, white hat hackers that are trying to break into your network and trying to figure out how to get to some flag or something that you give them on your internal network, whether it's a database or a file or something, and you say, hey, break into my network, go exploit the things you need to exploit, and then go capture this flag and then tell me where these weaknesses are at. Those are three very different things, and they're all part of a vulnerability management program, but you need to purchase them or apply them very differently. So the pen test, the red team exercise, can be a once a year exercise. Once a year you hire them come in and see what they can do. The external vulnerability scan, it should be a monthly or a quarterly type of a scan where, you're scanning that environment, looking for, new things that are exposed, because I'll tell you, people in your environment are standing up services all the time that IT may not know about. And so all of a sudden you will have some exposure facing the internet that you didn't even know was there. And that's why you need to do that, on a regular basis, so monthly or quarterly. And then the internal scan, like to me, that is the continuous scanning. This thing should be constantly just be looking through your environment, finding these vulnerabilities, because new vulnerabilities are announced every single day. And as those things get announced, they get fed into your vulnerability scanning database so that now you can look for those new things. And it might be too late if you don't scan for that thing for a week, because the time from vulnerability disclosure to exploitation is getting to be hours. In the past, maybe it was months, and then it was weeks. It's hours now. So from the point that some company discloses a vulnerability to the point where some adversary is reverse engineering that disclosure and coming up with an exploit is literally hours. And so that's why you have to continuously be looking across your environment to find those things. And once those known exploitable vulnerabilities are built into your database, you need to find them and then start to, put a priority on fixing those things. Because once a vulnerability is exploitable, it's just a ticking time bomb at that point, and you got to figure that out.
That's a great point, Earl. And actually, there's a question that came in here that kind of ties into something I was going to add on to that. So, I think you've spoken about reasons why people don't patch, right? So let's take the example of an outdated system. The vulnerability might still exist, but there isn't actually an update because it's 10, 15 years old. What else can you do? So one school of thought would be, I'll stick MDR on there and I'll just wait for an attack and I'll hope that catches it. Okay, I wouldn't put my eggs in that basket. The other approach, and thank you for the question, Joseph, how can you loop in configuration management? So whether you call it configuration management, compliance management, or you just look at a bunch of compensating controls, it doesn't matter what a system has in terms of all of its weaknesses. There are always things you can do to that system to make it more secure. So if you're not going to deploy a patch because it's not compatible, or the system can't be patched, or it's not compatible with a third-party application that also runs on that system, let's look at the overall configuration of that system. Let's look at compensating controls that could make it harder to exploit that weakness. So absolutely, the question was, do we see this as part of an advanced vulnerability management strategy? Absolutely. When we're talking about vulnerabilities here, but we should have clarified this earlier on, I'm not talking about CVE vulnerabilities. I'm talking about any weakness in the system that would allow an attacker to get access to it. Right? It doesn't need to be a CVE vulnerability. And the more we can do to that system to harden it, will prevent the majority of those automated attacks, and just make yourself a smaller target, reduce your attack surface, make it hard, and you'll be far less likely to be in the headlines having had a cyber breach in the near future.
Yeah, 100% agree. The configuration management and vulnerability management, to me, are very tightly aligned, but different, but they're very tightly aligned, cousin processes. The vulnerability management program should be feeding into the configuration management program. So in the sense that, when you say you have virtual machines, these are based on images that you create, and then you roll those out. Every time there's new vulnerabilities that come out, you should be updating your image to address for that. So that's why, like, if you look at, say, like Google Cloud or AWS or whatever, those people are constantly refreshing the server operating systems that the applications run on in those huge data centers. They're continuously updating them, like by the hour. because they're building those vulnerability recommendations and those vulnerability disclosures into their operating systems, and they know that they have to constantly be updating those operating systems to protect those servers. Well, businesses need to be doing the same thing. So if you know that you have, say you have a laptop image, and every time you buy a new laptop, you throw this image on there, your image better not be a year old. Your image should be getting updated, very often. So whether it's a monthly or, however frequently it is, but it shouldn't be any more than a month. You should be updating your image so that anytime you bring in a new laptop or a new desktop and you're building that out, you're not introducing a new device with old vulnerabilities on it, because then that's just something that you're later on going to scan, you're going to detect, and then you're going to have to go fix it again. So that's where configuration management really should accelerate your vulnerability management program, because you can constantly be building stronger, more secure images, which then lead to stronger and more secure devices, so you don't have to go back and fix that stuff later.
Absolutely. And I think we're not going to be able to get to all the questions here, but there was another question around differences between virtual and cloud and physical systems. And I think you just hit the nail on the head there. In a virtual and cloud environment, oftentimes a customer will have an old image that they deploy. And then the first thing they need to do is put an agent such as SecPod on there and start patching it and get it up to date. No, don't do that. The image should be up to date before it's deployed.
Definitely update those images, as frequently as you can, instead of taking the old deploy and then patch mentality, because you might not get to it, or depending on where that device is going, they've shown that if you put a device that's internet available, it will be exploited within like 5 minutes, just because there's constant scanning going on. And if you put something out there and those scans detect it, the automated exploitation will happen. So you don't want to have known weaknesses in a device and then try to come back later and patch it, because your patch cycle or your update cycle might not align with the exploitation cycle that is going to be subject to once it goes live.
Yeah, it would be kind of like buying a laptop that's 4 years old, sticking it on the internet and doing your online banking while it's downloading its patches. I mean, who would do that?
I've actually seen, in one client site, where they stood up a server. So this was a brand new server, and it already had like 200 vulnerabilities on it. It's like, how can this be? Like, you just literally built this thing, and then we scanned it, and it already had 200 vulnerabilities on it. So that's what I'm saying is, that image was many, many months old. And that's how many vulnerabilities had already been, discovered from the time that they created that image to the time we scanned it. So that's why you have to constantly be doing this. And once a year scans just aren't going to cut it. And once a year images aren't going to cut it. Like, this whole thing has to be continuous. And I do like the idea of integrating configuration management and vulnerability management, but I would just be happy if I saw more companies embracing vulnerability management and wrapping the processes and assigning the people that it needs to make it actually work, instead of having this be, the second and third or fourth or fifth job of somebody doing something else that, every once in a while I'll go check, for vulnerabilities.
Well, I think you'll be happier. I think more and more organizations are coming to the conclusion that something needs to change. So, we'll be side by side in that. I know we're wrapping on time here, Jagsir. Any other questions we want to get to? Or
I think it has been an interesting discussion, right? And I guess a lot of questions answered. And of course, if there are any other questions that the audience has, you can always post them to us or directly to Earl. We have Earl's email here, earl.duby, earl.duby @auxiom.com, or you can always visit www.auxiom.com and ask your questions directly to Earl. From an audience perspective, I think one last question that we would have for both of you, Rob and Earl, and Earl, I mean, you can go first, and Rob, you can follow. Is um, when we talk about the critical need, right? The word critical also emphasizes now, right? That it needs to be done now. Vulnerability management needs to be advanced, needs to be made advanced now. What would you suggest, Earl, to fellow CISOs or fellow community members, right? To help prioritize, and I know we talked about a lot of things, right? We talked about MDRs owning some of that responsibility, helping teams implement vulnerability management process. But from your perspective, what would you advise security teams if they want to prioritize? What would be what should they do, or what
Well, I think
metrics should they look at, right?
I think the very first thing you should do is identify if you actually have a vulnerability management tool, because I see lots of companies that don't. They're strictly relying on a Windows deployment tool, whether it's WSUS or something else, to deploy Windows patches, but then nothing else. And so it's not part of a holistic vulnerability management program. It's essentially just doing the monthly Microsoft patches, which leaves a ton of exposure out there. If you look at a lot of the recent attacks on companies, it's not through Microsoft patches, it's through other software flaws that are out there. And these are things that need to be discovered with a true vulnerability management tool. So it's great that you're doing Microsoft patching. Now you have to ask yourself, what are we doing about all of the rest of the risk that is in our technology environment?
Right.
Good points there, Earl. I think for me, Jagsir, the first thing I'd always say to any organization is to look at the process that they currently have today, right? Before the technology even. One of my first roles actually was with a company called Unisys, and we always talked about business process improvement as a precursor to anything else we were doing. So in this case, obviously, the business, the security functions are, or should be, helping to secure the environment. What does that process look today for you? Is there a separate team identifying to fix it? What's the integration between those two teams? Then what technologies are involved in that process? And I can say this, if it's complicated, it doesn't need to be. It shouldn't be. So that's the first, if you step back and you look at your process and it's complicated, that's the first problem. Look at how you can simplify the process, oftentimes with tools and technology, but the people process first, and then you will be more successful in securing your environment. Other than that, obviously a quick product plug, SecPod.com. Take a look at our solution, sign up for the free trial, and just put it across a few devices and see how it compares to your existing stack. You'll be impressed.
Perfect. Lovely conversation. Thanks for both of your perspectives. Once again, to our audience, a recorded version of this session will send to your email, as well as you can watch it later on our YouTube channel, on our Bright Talk channel, also on our website, which Rob said, secpod.com. And any questions you have for Earl, please feel free to shoot him an email at earl.duby@auxiom.com. You can also reach out to Earl and others at auxiom.com to learn more about how to build an advanced vulnerability management process and keep cyber attacks at bay. Thanks both. Thanks to our audience. I enjoyed my time on this conversation.
Me too.
Right.
Thanks, guys.
All right, thanks.
Appreciate the time.